Hello and welcome to the probably final entry in the Mild Speculation series. In this episode, we'll be talking about what I think early N5 will be like, offering some advice on kind of how to quote unquote survive the early edition. We'll be talking about foo strategies, early edition metagames, and getting through the red deck wins phase. And if that sounded like a weird word salad, don't worry, I will explain what all of those things mean. So what we'll be talking about in this video is basically how early edition change metagames work. So a game has just changed into a new edition. We've gone in this case from Infinity N4 to Infinity N5. What is that going to be like? How does the metagame early in the edition develop? And in order to answer that question, we'll look at something called first order optimal or FOO strategies, what they are and why understanding them is useful before jumping into my kind of number one predicted FOO strategy, which is the red deck wins phase of early edition metagame development. We'll then look at a few other possible early edition trends that might arise. This will be more speculative, just me thinking about what we might see, and generally spitballing just a little bit about what N5 will be like. Now, something I'm going to say now and reinforce multiple times over the course of this video is the importance of keeping an open and explorative mind and continuing to explore and iterate. Something that individuals and communities both have a strong tendency to do is to leap to the conclusion that whatever they have in front of them, whatever information they have, represents a solved state, even if that's ridiculous. And if you are at all a student of human psychology, you will know that that is rooted very much in how attractive and appealing the idea that we have control over the world or are in possession of special knowledge is. And so it is hugely common for people to look at the game that is in front of them and say, well, that's it. That's the solved state for Infinity. Infinity won't change beyond this, even if that's a ridiculous thing to say. And so I assure you that the first months, even the first 6 months, even the first year of Infinity N5 is not going to represent a sort of end of history final state. The game is going to continue to change. Our understanding of it will continue to grow and develop, and so keep exploring and iterating. There is going to be a lot to be discovered, and if you run into a problem or a challenge, particularly early in the edition, it's very likely that there is a solution out there somewhere if you just go and look for it. Now, let's get into the big concept for this video, which is a quick primer in what a first order optimal strategy is and why that's a useful tool for thinking about early edition metagames. So the concept of a FOO strategy is one of several ideas put forward in a book called Playing to Win by David Serlin. Now, Serlin was an avid fighting game player, and if you are familiar with the fighting game community, you will know that they have a serious and pretty intense competitive community. Now, as a bit of a disclaimer, as you might expect with a book that is titled Playing to Win, Serlin has kind of a take and an approach on what the best thing to do to be a player is. And there are a few, frankly, antisocial elements and antisocial takes or priorities that are put forward in Playing to Win. For example, Serlin has a sort of characterization of a certain kind of player that he calls a scrub, which is, yes, very judgmental, effectively. Serlin himself has spent quite a bit of time since 2005 walking back the more antisocial elements of his book, but the idea of FOO strategies is a really interesting and really useful one, and it's what we're going to be taking a look at today. So, what is a first order optimal strategy? Put simply, it's a strategy that gives you the maximum possible reward for the minimal possible complexity. And so, FOO strategies are typically those strategies that are discovered first as we move through and explore a game. Now, from memory, the example that Serlin gives as a fighting game player is the new player coming to a new fighting game for the first time might find some move that they can spam over and over and over to significantly good effect. It might be a high kick or a low kick or something like that. If you just keep doing that, it will just keep working and you will get wins as a result. And anyone who has, as a new player, played a fighting game, and I have only ever played fighting games as a very inexperienced player, you will probably recognize that, right? That idea that there's just one move that works well, and if you just keep doing that, you will win the game against a similarly inexperienced player is the a typical first order optimal strategy. Now, first order optimal strategies will generally, once they are discovered, remain part of the metagame, but they will be supplemented over time by higher order strategies as our understanding of the game deepens. Higher order strategies will emerge that represent ways to counter or surpass or just play better than first order optimal strategies. But these higher order strategies, although they provide greater benefit in terms of your ability to win the game, will also require greater complexity, often with a kind of diminishing return. The most difficult or challenging or complicated or niche strategies to execute will only, like, knowing and understanding and being able to execute those will not increase your win rate as much as first learning how to spam a low kick did, but they are necessary to pursue if you want to keep improving. So the basic idea of a foo strategy is that it is easy to learn. It's something that you discover first that will give you good initial results, but will eventually be surpassed or replaced, maybe remaining as an element of your knowledge base, but not the end state of the game. So why is the idea and the understanding of a foo strategy useful when we think about the coming Infinity N5 edition? Well, the answer to that is that, in a sense, N5 is kind of going to be a new game, and we're kind of all going to be new players. New editions of wargames aren't necessarily a complete tabula rasa, a complete blank slate, but they do represent a significant change to the existing game. The cumulative effect of many small changes is going to be very large, and what was good before is not guaranteed to be good in N5. So we need to find what's good in N5. New options need to be explored, new ideas need to be found. And what this means is that many of the strategies that people develop and employ early in N5 are going to be foo strategies. Now, looking for and finding these strategies is an excellent way to build a strong initial list. And finding these strategies for yourself is rewarding, right? Foo strategies are not morally or tactically bad. They're good, right? They represent a good immediate return on your investment and will do things for you that are good, but they're not a solved state, and you will probably eventually move past them. So bear this in mind, right? If you find something that you're like, oh, this seems really strong and I'll just do it a lot, that's awesome, right? That's fun and good, but keep exploring, because your opponents are also going to find those things and you are going to need to learn how to counter them, and they will learn how to counter your counter. That kind of exploration is, at least for me, one of the really fun parts of a new edition of any wargame. So embrace that. And just as another note, kind of remember that iteration cycles for wargames are long. And when I talk about an iteration cycle, the process of testing and learning something takes longer for wargames, even with big online communities that talk to each other, than they do in many other games. So to think about something like, say, a strategy game, something like StarCraft, for example, a player in StarCraft might be able to play 2 or 3 or 6 or 10 games in a practice session or more, and they might be able to play a practice session every night if they were really serious. And so even a moderately competitive StarCraft player might play 20 or 30 games in a week easily, whereas most players of Infinity might be lucky to get 1 or 2 games a week. Some people might get more, but even when I am most active, I play at most 3 games a week, and that's a lot. For many people, they will play maybe 1 game a month. And so this means that development of our understanding of Infinity happens proportionally very slowly. Our capacity to explore and test new ideas is constrained by how quickly we can play games, and that means that there is a long tail of possible exploration. So, just as a reminder, don't assume the game is solved a few weeks or even a few months in. Even players who have played a lot will not have played enough games for that to be something that they can really decisively say. So, with that primer in first order optimal strategies, let's look at one first order optimal strategy that I pretty much do expect to see in Infinity N5, which is the red deck wins or aggressive metagame stage. So, a very common first order optimal strategy in any game where aggression exists in tension with defense or control is just the success of extreme aggression. And the name red deck wins comes from Magic the Gathering. And although, frankly, I am not much better of a Magic the Gathering player than I am a fighting game player, I do enjoy watching metagame cycles in Magic the Gathering just a little bit, just casually. And one of the things that I have seen and watched, which I find very interesting, is when a new set or a new standard rotation occurs in Magic the Gathering, and you're in those very early weeks because Magic the Gathering iterates very quickly, because Magic the Gathering players can play games very, very fast, kind of like StarCraft players. You will often see an archetype being successful in things like the Magic Arena Online ladder, which is a red deck wins deck archetype, which is a very, very aggressive list archetype. So a red deck wins deck is one which goes, I win the game by reducing your hit points total from 20 to 0, so I'm going to do that at the expense of everything else as quickly as possible. And the nature of these decks is that as the metagame reaches maturity, they can be good and they can work quite well, but they will usually fade out. But early in an edition cycle, they can be very, very powerful. And the reason for that is that successfully defending is itself a higher order strategy. In order to defend efficiently against aggressive tactics, we have to see and play against and understand that aggression, which means that it's impossible to learn to defend against something until you have seen what it is that you are defending against. And so aggressive tactics always have the initial advantage. Aggressive tactics are a foo strategy. And to give an Infinity example, in early N4, yes, the game in early N4 was with different rules to late N4. The way fire teams worked, for example, is different. But in early N4, there were many people who complained about how overpowered they perceived JSA to be. And if you are a player who did not play in early N4 and only played in late N4, you might be forgiven for thinking that sounds insane. But early N4 was a period of the game where there were significant changes, right? In N3 to N4, among other things, we saw the introduction of the tactical window 15 trooper limit, which meant that many of the old ways for defending, i.e., with waves of 5-point ablative troopers that you could afford to lose because they represented a proportionally small amount of your force, just stopped being useful because you only had 15 troopers, and while you could take some cheap models to defend, you could build a crumple zone into a list. That crumple zone was much smaller than it was in N3. At the same time, new defensive tools that had been introduced in N4, like hacking that's actually good and doesn't immediately die to a single killer hacker, which was a thing in N3, right? Hacking in N3 was at best a risky proposition because killer hackers were extremely powerful. But in early N4, most people hadn't figured out that hacking was good. So we have an environment where everyone's crumple zones are a little bit diminished, there are fewer ablative troopers to defend with, and no one has really figured out how good hacking is as part of a complete defensive mix. And there is a strategy that has access to, among other things, 17-point heavy infantry with with light shotguns that can be linked with Japanese Tanko. And so there was an extremely powerful archetype that was basically a bunch of samurai running across the board and killing you because no one knew how to defend against it. It was a very effective, aggressive strategy. It was Infinity's version of Red Deck Wins, and it was good for months into Infinity N4 while people complained viciously about just how powerful JSA was. Now, fast forward 2 or 3 years, and okay, firstly, there have been rules changes that have adjusted the power of JSA. That Tanko and Samurai link is no longer a pure link, so the gunfighting elements of it that support the advance of the Tanko are not as powerful, etc., etc. Also, new models have been released in other factions that shift the balance of the game. But even setting those aside, the idea that a 10 order, no tactical awareness, just regular old NCO maybe link could trample across the board and annihilate your entire army in its deployment zone is a bit of a farce now, because once they start attacking, they start breaking stealth, and once they start breaking stealth, they're vulnerable to hacking. And in terms of their offensive ability, you can absolutely stop a Daiyokai with the right arrows. Like, the idea that a Japanese samurai link is unstoppable is ridiculous in 2024. But in 2020, people very seriously took, like, even very good players, right? Like, players who were top of the leaderboard in N3 expressed concern over how powerful the JSA Samurai Link was. But collectively, over time, we figured out how to beat it, how to defend against it, and the game moved on past that early dominant aggressive phase. But we did have to go through that early dominant aggressive phase because aggression is a highly successful strategy early in the edition. It's not going to last, and depending on your personal playstyle, you might be able to get an early jump over it by just emphasizing defensive technology in your own lists, but it is something that we expect to see. And so, as a result, my advice to you as N5 rolls in is to option one, lean into aggression as a viable playstyle. Look for new tools and new profiles and new ways of attacking that maybe didn't exist in the previous edition, or which can no longer be effectively defended against due to changes in the defensive tools relative to the previous edition, and go for it. Exploit those kind of opportunities, play aggressively, because it's a fun time, right? It's a fun time of the edition to pursue aggressive playstyles because those aggressive playstyles will probably work. Alternatively, option two, be aware that running into aggressive playstyles is something that you're a little more likely to see and which you are a little less equipped to deal with because you have not learned how to use the defensive tools that 5th edition offers you. And so just emphasize defensive play, right? Early edition lists, one approach that can work very well is just the first thing you do is you put all of your defensive tools in, everything you think you might need to run a defense, even if it's excessive, and accept the fact that you might be a bit more offensively limited as a result and just play around that in play. That can be a very good way to get through an aggressive phase, and over time you will learn what parts of that defensive mix work, what can maybe be pared back to give you more versatility or more mission options, but basically just wind back over time your defensive focus once you have survived that early edition aggressive metagame and begin to understand exactly how much it is that you need and no more. In either case, the thing to bear in mind is that this is a foo strategy phase. Whatever it is that emerges as a very strong attacker in N4 is going to be transitory in its nature, right? It will arrive and it will be very, very powerful because we won't know how to defend against it, and then we will learn how to defend against it, and the metagame will continue to evolve, and just to bear that evolution in mind. Iteration in wargames happens slowly, but it does happen. And so if you run into any kind of first order optimal strategy that seems insurmountable, just give it thought, think about it, practice against it, and learn how to beat it, because it is absolutely something that you will be able to learn how to beat as your own understanding of the edition evolves. Now, beyond the very general red deck wins style of metagame that I do expect to see early in N5, it's a little more difficult to predict what else we might see because, frankly, until we see the complete rules and until we see all of the new profiles that were being added to the game, it is difficult to really predict what people will hone in on. But I do have a few thoughts about what is likely to be common or popular early in the edition, and many of them, frankly, are just people trying out all of the new toys to the maximum extent possible. That is to say, kind of spammy. You will often see spammy lists early in an edition, and things that we might see being spammed are things like duos. Fireteam duos promise to be considerably better than they were in Infinity N4, and so you will probably see lots of them in lists or lists that use lots of them. I also kind of expect people to spend quite a bit of time playing with the new turrets. Unless the rules for the new automated turrets that we are seeing now on multiple profiles are complete garbage, if they are even just basically what the turrets in the current ITS season are like, then I very much expect to see some early lists that just try and put as many of these in play as possible. I kind of the it's free real estate vibe, but if we look at, say, the Kestrel Firefly with Mine Layer and an automated turret, you will absolutely see Kestrel lists that have like 3 or 4 of those if they can. Now, are those lists going to be good? That's a very good question. They are, emphasizing defense in a part of the game a part of the metagame where we expect to see offensive tactics dominant. And so, in that respect, they are kind of leaning into my recommendation two from the previous slide. But whether they are good on their own merits, because these turrets are fundamentally going to be probably single use, as in single deployment, low ballistic skill, average gunfighters that are easily overtaken by anything that just brings a gun to bear on them. And particularly if we look at things like the Kestrel 21 point engineer, right? 21 points for a regular order and a mine layer turret, not necessarily the best possible deal. So finding lists that actually make proper use of them is going to be its own thing. But I definitely expect to see at least some lists that make lots of use of turrets. And I am going to play lists that make lots of use of these turrets because the concept of an automated turret is something that I've wanted to have in Infinity basically forever. Another thing that I expect to see is just spam lists generally, right? Flavor of the week spam, whatever it is that the community latches onto as good in the early edition. Heavy infantry or tags or drop troops, if they're all discounted, vehicles, like whatever, right? Something will, or possibly multiple somethings, will emerge as something the community thinks is good. And so you will inevitably see lists that try and make maximal use of that thing. Now, those lists themselves will see refinement over time. I personally wouldn't be surprised if the new vehicles are pretty good, but I would also be surprised if maximum availability in every list of those new vehicles was good. So we will see an initial state where people are taking as many of them as possible, and then over time pairing those lists back to, oh, okay, it turns out that the new vehicles are pretty good, but because they are Silhouette 7 and can't take cover, they can be a little fragile if you're not going first, so it's important to be able to deploy them safely, and so maybe one of them is actually the correct number in any given list pairing. That's a rough prediction for how that kind of evolution could take place. But to get there, we will see spam lists that absolutely maximize them, which means we will spend some time playing against those spam lists. Another thing I expect to see and will myself play is a literally take every new thing kind of list. For something like Kestrel or JSA, this will mean trying to take maybe one of everything. But for factions like generic factions that have gotten some new units or sectorals that have gotten some new units, you will have those kind of armies where you play that sectoral. Maybe you play a solid and well-rounded list, but then you just put every single new thing in addition to that you can. And those lists usually aren't necessarily fantastic, but firstly, they're fun. And honestly, it isn't a bad idea. Even if that list might lose you a game here or there, playing those kind of test bed lists where, because the iteration cycle in wargames is slow, right? We just don't get to play that many games. Having your games be as robust a testing experience as possible, where you give all of these new models a chance to show their quality, can be a really great way to get at least some initial experience. Now, the people with scientific backgrounds who are watching this video will probably be experiencing a revulsion response in response to that, because the scientific method is to change one variable at a time, test that, and then move on to the next variable. But we don't have that luxury in a war game, particularly if we're only playing one game a week, one game a fortnight, one game a month. And especially if you are only playing, say, one game a fortnight, then just putting everything that you possibly want to test into a list, and one particular model had a great game, it was that model's turn to be a hero in this particular game, cool, I'm going to focus on that in subsequent games and come back around to the other stuff, can be a very fun way to approach exploration and iteration of lists. Finally, I also inevitably expect to see people just playing lists that were good in N4 and complaining that they're good in N5. This is going to be about as inevitable as the sun rising in the east. And we all know those people, right? We've all been on the internet. We all know the person who has that big energy of, I was mediocre in N3 and I'll be mediocre in N4, and by God, I'll be mediocre in N5 as well, and tell everybody about it. People will try and rely on their existing experience. There are people who will not embrace the new edition with an attitude of exploration and iteration, and those people we're just going to have to politely bear with their opinions. You're going to see Nomad players running the Nomad list from N4. You're going to see Combined Army players running the Combined Army list from N4. And you're going to see Pan-Oceanian players complaining that they can't run the Pan-Oceanian list from N4. Those are all going to be things that will happen, and the way to deal with that is to just let it wash over and through you, to allow to emerge from within you the ability to let a person just be wrong on the internet. It's fine, they are fine, move on and learn the game yourself with an attitude of exploration. Now, in terms of armies that I expect to be popular, I think it's pretty likely, especially that Kestrel will be popular in early N5. JSA will to an extent as well, mostly off the aesthetic of the army. All of the new miniatures, like the Beyond box for Sand Trap, is one of the best sets of sculpts on both sides I think I've seen Corvus Belli put out in ages. Even that JSA model with the resting HMG pose is just an absolute killer. So both armies will be popular, but I expect Kestrel to be more popular and see more play, at least initially. Kestrel is shaping up to be both very approachable and very powerful, and we can see that in profiles like the Hectari shooters, for example, which are just apex, like absolute apex gunfighters that can be given link bonuses on top of that. The new JSA profiles I do think are good, but because they are inevitably a little bit hybrid, right? They are paying for both whatever gunfighting and specialist capability they might have, plus close combat in many cases. I expect that learning how to maximize JSA as an army is something that might require a bit more nuance and take a bit more time. Kestrel, by comparison, is just going to be very good out the gate because they will just gunfight very well, and they even look like they'll defend pretty well. They look both technical in the way that Acontecimento was, but also powerful, just good, clean profiles. So I expect Kestrel to be popular. What else is going to be popular from other factions is really much more difficult to say, but there is a pretty good bet that if an army got new models, then it will see some play. So for example, Vanilla Ariadna and Cosmoflot are both getting the new Dog and Engineer combo. And while I had to draw deep on my personal reserves of ability to let people be wrong on the internet, when I saw some of the takes about how those are less powerful than bear pods, because yes, a 10-point model should be less powerful than a bear pod. They are absolutely awesome models in the first instance. The Robo Antipode, particularly having seen it painted up, looks fantastic. And relative to the cost, those profiles seem really good. Like the Antipode is just solid defense plus clean utility at a very cheap cost. And the Engineer, well, one is an engineer, which making use of an Ariadne may require a little bit of work, but the Antipode has structure. But two, it's one of your deployable turret pieces. So if you want to experiment with deployable turrets, that's one of the things to do. Similarly, factions like Onyx Contact Force and Vanilla Combined Army getting the new Team Achilles profiles, people will absolutely play those. If they're garbage, then people will only play them for a little while, but I think it's reasonably likely that they will be solid because Corvus Belli will want them to be exciting and good and to sell those miniatures. So we can expect to see those kind of factions a lot early in N5 as well. Regardless, no matter what metagame emerges, just remember that it is an early edition metagame. It's not a solved state. There will be lots to keep exploring, many new iterations to make, and that whatever emerges as an immediately dominant strategy early in the edition will probably be transitory, and new and equally dominant strategies will emerge over time, and we will learn to defend against those too. And that just about wraps up this video and therefore the mild speculation series, which means it's time to turn our minds toward what kind of content we want to see as N5 rolls around. At time of recording, N5 is just a little over a week away, which means it's time for me to ask all of you what kind of content you want to see in the new edition. Do you want to see a continuation of the Faction Focus series into Infinity N5? Do you want to see rules explainers or examination of some of the new rules that are going to be revealed and released in the new edition? Do you want to see return of battle reports? It's been a little while since I've done a battle report. I do less of those these days, mostly because I've really enjoyed doing the Faction Focus series, but do we want to see N5 battle reports? Do we want to see an absolutely deranged all factions hot take tier list, just for example? Please do let me know in the comments. I do read all of the comments against my videos. I will really take into consideration whatever it is people say that they would like to see. Otherwise, Just as a reminder, if you like this video and you'd like to support the content that I'm making, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. At this stage, I am not sure what the next video will be, other than that there will be something, and I hope very much that you've enjoyed this one, and I will see you next time.